Hello and welcome to this show doesn't have a name. Let's be honest. It's very much a breaking news situation we are in. Delighted to be joined by Rich Jones. My name is Martin Domin. First of all, as you can see from the screen, Rich Jones, my colleague at Mirror Fighting. And we are both, I think, delighted to be able to bring to you news just breaking in the last half hour that Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury have now signed contracts for their, let's call it a £200 million mega fight, because those are the numbers that are circulating. It's been a long time coming. I have to go back to last summer now, Rich, when Eddie Hearn, sort of out of the blue, really announced that a financial deal had been agreed in terms of a 50-50 split for the first fight and then a 60-40 split for the rematch in favour of the winner of the first fight. A lot's happened since then. A lot hasn't happened since then, including, Fury not fighting Wilder. But just your first reaction to the news, at least this first step of the process, is done.
Yeah, I think it's just what everyone's wanted to hear, isn't it? The fact that obviously we've had this sort of agreement hanging over us for sort of a year or so, or since Eddie Hearn first mentioned it. So I think the fact that, finally pen to paper has been, has happened, and, the agreement's been made official with contracts and stuff like that is welcome news, really, isn't it? Because I think, as you've mentioned, a lot's happened. There's been a lot of complications. Obviously, COVID has sort of, maybe thrown the timelines out a little bit. So, as boxing fans, we're used to sort of maybe being let down when it comes to the biggest fights sometimes. So to finally have sort of contracts signed and sealed according to Eddie Hearn's a big development, especially for what's, one of the biggest fight out there at the minute. So, yeah, exciting times.
Well, I remember, if you go back just over a year, I guess after Fury beat Wilder in LA, in Vegas, there was a lot of talk then about Fury Joshua, naturally so, given we had two British world heavyweight champions. But I remember thinking that this is far too premature, because you had a Fury Wilder rematch, which was contracted. You had Joshua had to fight Pulev. You had Deontay Wilder, Dillian White as the sort of mandatory for the WBC. And you had Alexander Usyk as the mandatory for the WBO. So we're looking at, so many hurdles in the way of Joshua Fury that I was quite dismissive of it about a year ago. But all of a sudden, things just changed very quickly. Of course, COVID pushed back Joshua Pulev into summer. It pushed back Wilder Fury, three times, until eventually Fury just said, I'm not bothering. And it turns out that, that he has every right to do that. I think after a certain time, he could do that anyway. Dillian White gets beat by Alexander Povetkin, knocked out, no less. And then the WBO, surprisingly, in this world of sanctioning bodies and playing games, said, yep, go ahead, we'll hold back Alexander Usyk. Are you surprised that it's happening at all now, but also for all four belts?
I think the biggest surprise to me is not that it's happening, it's that it's going to happen for all four belts. I thought there was quite a likelihood that, the WBO might enforce the Usyk mandatory, and I thought, it was one of those fights that whilst it's going to be sold on all four belts, the undisputed, I think it obviously had the strength to get through if there was sort of maybe one belt missing. But I think the fact that it sounds like it's going to happen for all four belts just makes it pretty much as big as it possibly could be. But I think in terms of it actually happening, I was always quite confident once a few things sort of fell into place. I think obviously Dillian White's defeat kind of helped the case in terms of his mandatory position, and then the way COVID sort of played out. And also when you look at, Anthony Joshua obviously having that shock defeat, against Andrew Ruiz, obviously come back from that. But I think, the fact that he had that loss in terms of everyone around him, it's kind of shown how sort of precious the position can be in boxing. I mean, until that, it was all about the sort of Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder fight. And the fact things have changed so much since then, I think everyone involved now, given everything that's happened to both fighters in their careers, kind of realises that you can't afford to pass up on the opportunity to make a fight of this magnitude, really. I think they couldn't afford to wait for everything to be perfect. It's one of those, they had to take the chance while it was there. It's obviously going to make them both huge money. And, the fact that all the belts are looking like they're going to be on the line for it just makes it even bigger, really.
Definitely it will be the first undisputed heavyweight world champion since Lennox Lewis in 1999. And I think the first four-belt heavyweight world champion as well. Actually, in a year in which we could see, we'll see at least one other undisputed world champion in the light welterweight division, when Josh Taylor takes on Jose Ramirez in May. We should say, of course, although contracts have been signed and the fight will happen, we still have two outstanding issues, being quite big ones with the venue and with the date. And I think initially we talked about April and May. That's been pushed back to June. It could well be pushed back into July now. And in terms of venues, Saudi Arabia has always been the number one choice, it seems, or at least the Middle East, because of the site fee they can pay. But there is a real issue at the moment because of the fact that nobody can really guarantee that even in 3 months or 4 months, we can definitely have X number of fans in whatever kind of arena, whether it's a purpose-built one, whether it's one that already exists. So it's going to be tricky. It always felt like, they'd sign contracts that would be done. There'd be so many options to host a fight that Eddie Hearn just has to choose. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, given it's very hard to say, yes, we can definitely have 20,000 even in the summer.
Yeah, it's going to be a tricky one. I think it's it's given a bit of an excuse almost to sort of take it away from the UK, and the fact that obviously it's two British fighters fighting for the undisputed world heavyweight title. I think in an ideal world, pretty much every fan would say it's the sort of fight that you'd want to see at sort of Wembley Stadium or something like that. But I think given the given the uncertainty and the COVID situation, it almost gives, for the first fight at least, a bit of a get out of jail free card in the fact that they can take it somewhere where perhaps the fans might not be as important to the sort of the revenue and the money that it can command. So I think, obviously you look at Saudi Arabia, who paid sort of a huge site fee for the Joshua Ruiz rematch. You could see something similar happening again, and it means that the purses perhaps aren't as sort of dependent on the ticket money of sort of 90,000 fans at Wembley. So it's going to be a tricky one there, because the whole, as you say, the whole world, it's kind of still being impacted by coronavirus. There's different sort of restrictions in different places. Things are changing all the time. I mean, obviously you saw Dillian White's fights ending up being sort of Gibraltar, which is obviously a bit of a bizarre one. And I think when AJ fought Pulev and we got a few fans back in the arena, everyone thought that was going to be the turning point, but then we were sort of back to square one. So it just sort of showed how quickly the situation can move. So going to be interesting to see where it ends up. And you can guarantee wherever it ends up, everyone's not going to be entirely pleased, but we'll see what happens. I think the fact that we're just going to get the fight is the main thing.
Definitely. I mean, of course, you can't. It's hard to imagine sort of Wembley. Obviously, Joshua's fought there several times. We know what it's like, but the idea of having such a big fight at Wembley, of course, would be incredible. 90,000. It would be for the fans. But as Eddie Hearn has said so many times, how do you ask, both fighters to take 50% of their money to basically please 90,000 people who can go? That's it. Those are the only people who benefit from it being at Wembley. The same number of people will still buy it on pay-per-view, still earn that same money. You're basically holding a fight at Wembley for the 90,000 who are lucky enough to go. And what we have to hope is that is a two-fight deal, of course. I'm sure, if either man wants to walk away, he could do so. But the hope is there's a second fight, then takes place at the back end of this year. Unlikely to be Wembley if it's sort of towards the winter, but in Cardiff with the roof on. And then at least British fight fans get the chance to go. Here's a question for you. If we do get a second fight in Cardiff, what's the most money you'd be willing to pay for a ticket?
It's a tricky question. It depends how much you can afford to pay for a ticket.
Let's think. What's the cheapest ticket normally at Wembley or Cardiff? It's maybe £40.
I think I went to when I was at uni. I went to the Takam fight. It was meant to be the Pulev fight, wasn't it? Takam came in as a replacement, and we were students, and we got the cheapest tickets we could. I think we paid like £30 on resale. They were sort of meant to be 40 or 50, and we were literally the top row of the Millennium Stadium. You could barely see a thing. You needed binoculars. But I think for a fight like that, if you're paying sort of £40 to watch sort of Joshua Pulev or Joshua Takam, as it turned out to be, I think you've got to be looking at, like, even for the cheaper seats, you'd be looking sort of 100, 150 plus, surely, just to be there, because it's such a historic occasion. I think, is it Frank Warren that said a while ago it'd be sort of the biggest sporting event in this country since the '66 World Cup final? I think it'd be hard to disagree with that, to be honest, because there's such a broad appeal to it. Like, all the casual sort of boxing fans know and sort of pick a side. It's got such sort of broad appeal. It's obviously the most glamorous division in boxing, the heavyweight division. I think it'd be, the tickets would be going for a huge price. I mean, they'd sell out in seconds and be on resale for a ridiculous fee, I'm sure. But
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much the VIP seats cost. I mean,
yeah, a lot.
I wouldn't be shocked if you're talking definitely 5,000. I would imagine. I wouldn't be surprised if they just went, you know what, let's just do 10, because people will pay. People would pay. So as we said, the contracts are signed, pen to paper, venue and date to be announced. We have, of course, as we often do, had plenty of odds come our way after the announcement, both in terms of who's going to win, but also when it's going to happen and where it's going to happen. So Betfair have it at 6-4 June, 5-4 July. So one of the two, as expected. Saudi Arabia, the favourite to host the fight at 2-1 on. America, I mean, Vegas coming into play potentially now, starting to have fans. Texas, of course, starting to have fans now. But again, that site fee probably ends up being crucial. In terms of the winner, Fury has been a favourite for a long time, 4-7 with Betfair. Joshua 11-8. Have you? Okay, let's go back a year, maybe after Fury fought Wilder. Have your thoughts on Joshua Fury then changed to where we are today?
I mean, I think immediately after the Fury Wilder rematch, I think everyone who watched that would have been all in on Fury, wouldn't they? But I think obviously Joshua's come back. He's looked really, really strong in the fights against the rematch against Ruiz and then the Pulev fight as well. And I think, I don't know, he's been out. Fury's been out of the ring for a long time, hasn't he? I think in terms of the performance against Wilder, you'd certainly make him the favourite, but he's been out of the ring for a long time. I don't think his preparation has been as ideal as Joshua's. So I think I'd still make Fury the favourite, but I think it's certainly a lot more of a 50-50 than it was sort of immediately after that Wilder fight. Would that be how you'd assess it as well? Or
I think the point you make about being out of the ring is important, mainly because Fury himself has been quite vocal recently in talking about that being a problem. He mentioned it about Conor McGregor in the UFC and then about Joshua Warrington, who was obviously knocked out not so long ago. The only thing I would say about that for Fury is when he came back in 2018, okay, his first two fights against Ferry and Pianetta were, so forgettable. It's best not to talk about them anymore. But because they were so forgettable, and so he can't have learned much. I mean, one stopped early and one went 12 rounds, just boring. And then, so even though he had two fights before he fought Wilder the first time, they weren't exactly incredible preparation. Yet he went in there for 12 rounds against Wilder, got up twice. Yeah. After the best part of 3 years out, drinking, taking drugs, and doing whatever he did. So, yes, I suspect you're right. In terms of the odds closing a little bit, in terms of people's opinion changing, it probably is a closer fight. But we can't, as sort of pundits or people thinking about what's going to happen, you can't really take into consideration things you don't know. Fury may well struggle for being out for so long, but we don't know that. And let's be honest, he won't know that until he gets in there. So based on what we know, and I think I've said this before, what Fury does, he does, or everything Fury does, he does better than Joshua. It's very difficult, I think, if they're both at their peak, to see how Joshua wins, which is a strange thing to say for a man who has 3 of the 4 heavyweight world titles. But what we have now, of course, we're in March, we've got best part of 4 months of a build-up. And I think that in itself is going to be very, very interesting. We've seen Fury over the last week or so, or even the last month or so, talking about how he didn't think the fight was happening imminently. And I understand that it's probably mind games, but it's a bit of a strange thing to do, is it not? When everybody else is saying it's happening, I don't really understand why he would come out and say, first of all, it's probably not going to happen. Then I'm not training, I'm just drinking, I'm not eating, I'm not training, I'm just drinking 12 pints a day. We both know he talks a lot of rubbish sometimes, but is it all part of mind games, or do you think he's just sort of struggling because he's been out of the ring and doesn't have much to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is mind games. Like you say, he's always been one for saying things that are maybe not the most believable and having a lot to say. I think it probably is a struggle not being in the ring, but I think a lot of it is mind games, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how Anthony Joshua copes with the mind games and stuff as well, because he doesn't really. I don't know. He never, obviously, he's not tended to engage that much. But then you look at the one time he really did engage and someone sort of seemed to get under his skin was Jarrell Miller, the first fight, which obviously never happened. But you remember that press conference got a bit explosive, and that was probably the sort of biggest fight of AJ's career at that point, going out to America. and that sort of got a bit interesting. Then the Pulev fight in the weigh-in, it got sort of a bit more heated than people would have expected. So I mean, I think the mind games aspect of it, and whatever happens, the build-up's going to be fascinating, isn't it? Because they're two sort of such different characters. People obviously people feel passionately about one or the other either way. It's going to be an interesting build-up. I think interested to see Fury's mind game sort of get under his skin, because they certainly sort of seem to get under Wilder's skin in that press tour before their fight. And that was interesting. I mean, we've seen when it comes to the press tours and the build-up, there's not really many better talkers and many better at sort of working a crowd than Tyson Fury. So it's going to be interesting to see how Anthony Joshua reacts to that and how it goes, I suppose.
Definitely. There's no doubt Joshua throughout his career has held back from engaging too much, maybe dealing White a little bit, and Miller, as you suggested. So hopefully, Fury does just try and needle him a little bit, and hopefully Joshua responds. I mean, it's not a fight that needs selling particularly. I think they could probably keep quiet for 4 months, and the same number of people would buy it. But 4 months is a long time, so let's hope there is more to it. Listen, you can join in live. You can send your comments. Friend of the show, Adam McManus, says, Fury is a natural boxer and talent. Joshua was a natural athlete. He's been taught to box. Fair?
I think there's no doubt Fury's the more natural boxer of the two. But, Joshua's sort of, I think he's perhaps a bit underrated in terms of his boxing ability. Obviously, he's a huge athlete, and I see the point in that he has obviously been taught to box, but I think he's got a lot of experience. Obviously, won Olympic gold, and I think we've sort of started to see his boxing come to the fore a bit more. His last couple of fights, he was used to sort of just going in there, taking people out, and that's what that proved his undoing in the first fight against Andy Ruiz. But then in the second fight, he sort of he boxed his head off, really, and people were talking about how Andy Ruiz was sort of a decent boxer before that, and he boxed his head off in that, and he looked good against Kubrat Pulev, who again had got a lot of experience. I think obviously you'd expect Fury to be the sort of more natural boxer, and you'd expect he's probably got more on that side of things. But I think Joshua certainly can box. I think it's going to be interesting to see how he approaches it, because does he try and outbox Fury? Because if he does, it's sort of fighting fire with fire. Obviously, does he go into it with a different approach, try and sort of rough Fury up a bit, try and get at him early on? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how the game plans unfold really when it happens, because they've got two sort of interesting styles. Obviously, styles make fights. I'll be intrigued to see what fight these two serve up, to be honest.
Definitely. Well, at least we do now know that fight, all being well, which we can't say too often these days, will indeed happen. As we said, contract signed June or July, likely Saudi Arabia. Those details still to come. Thank you, Richard, for your time. And thank you all for tuning in. Take care, and we'll speak to you soon.